Follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and review it on iTunes with the links below. Cause I know a lot of you like to listen to this show while you drive or work or go to sleep. Thanks so much. Don't lose yourself in the music or the moment. Nah, all the cool folks are getting lost in the woods. Imagine seeing nothing but forest for miles and having no clue which direction leads you home and which direction leads you deeper into the green abyss. Enjoy these allegedly true scary lost in the woods stories, and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear about some rest stop encounters soon. Now, let's begin. The Witch of Mount Edziza, from Gazebo King. My story begins outdoors. My friend Ricky and I enjoyed hikes through the woods. We always found it a great way to relax after the work week, and so every Saturday, we'd make the 30 or so kilometer drive to Mount Edziza. It's a beautiful national park in northwestern British Columbia, featuring a huge amount of woods that climb the gradual slopes of the mountain. That day was no different from our usual. We were working our way up a trail, occasionally photographing the natural scenery. Now, keep in mind this park is very isolated, as in it's in the middle of nowhere. It's a minimum hour drive from the nearest town, and the lack of accessibility led to it being one of British Columbia's less popular parks. Very rarely do you ever meet another person on the trails. That's why when my friend first mentioned it, I thought he was messing with me. I was bending down to tie my boot when Ricky quietly said, "Whoa," out loud. I look up. What is it? He glances at me before turning and searching up the path. I just saw some girl up there. Where? Up there. He pointed with his finger to the end of the visible trail. She was looking at us, and then she disappeared up the path. I was puzzled. What did she look like? I don't know. Barely saw her. I felt pretty strange after this. After all, it was late August. The weather was cloudy, and there was even a little bit of rain. We rarely saw people during peak hiking days, so it was extremely unlikely he actually saw a person that day. Despite that, Rick wasn't the type to lie for no reason, so I figured he really did see someone. We continued walking up the trail. As we neared where he said he saw the girl, we began to pick up on a smell. This smell was faint at first, gradually increasing the closer we got to the bend in the path. The best way I could describe it is a bouquet of flowers. If you ever spent time in a florist shop, you know what I mean. It was heavy and concentrated, like we just walked into a room filled with nothing but roses. Still though, something about it was off in some way. It was distracting, and it made me want to follow it. "Do you smell that?" I asked. "Yeah." Ricky inhaled deeply through his nose. "What is it?" I shook my head, not bothering to reply, because I really didn't know. We looked around, and despite how strong the smell was, we didn't see anything that could have been responsible for that peculiar odor. Now, the forest along the mountainside is lush and full of life, but it's predominantly trees. There are a few wildflowers, but there's no way the floral aroma should have been this strong. We stopped at the bend in the path to drink from our water bottles, sitting on a large fallen tree. There weren't any people or anything else out of the ordinary, aside from that strange smell. Eventually, we moved up the path again. After about 50 footfalls, the flower smell seemed to stay the same, more or less, no matter how far we walked. We worked our way through the rest of the hike pretty quickly, and yes, the flowery smell remained constant the entire time. We eventually theorized that some rare, extra stinky flower was in bloom on the mountainside, which served as explanation enough. A medium fog seemed to settle over the mountain, which wasn't anything new. As we walked, though, we began to realize something was off. I was the first one to notice. It felt as if I was being hit with a wave of déjà vu. Hey Rick, does that tree look familiar? Ricky looked at me and followed my hand, seeing where I was pointing. Wait, didn't we pass that half an hour ago? Somehow, without being aware of it, we were back at the fallen tree we took a break at before. We followed the path the entire time and we knew it hadn't looped, so it was impossible we were back here. Seriously, what the heck? How did we get here? Rick seemed a little alarmed. I don't know, man. Should we just head back? Rick looked at me for a moment before nodding. I guess so, he whispered. Remember how the fallen tree was right at the peak of the path before it turned? That led us all the way down the hill, and so we should have been able to see approximately where we entered from. When we looked down the trail, though, preparing to head back, what we saw was unnerving. The path went down like it should, but right at the lowest point, where it should have swerved left into the opening of the woods, it went back up the hill again. It was like the entire forest was mirrored somehow. And at the very end of the hill, we could just make out two men standing there, wearing the exact same clothes as us. Dude, do you see that? I was already staring when Ricky frantically pointed towards the other peak, where our duplicates stood. We walked forward a little. What in the world? That's when we noticed that the man who was dressed exactly like Ricky seemed to move further away. Rather quickly, given the circumstances, we were able to comprehend that the people we saw were mirroring our movements, or perhaps we were mirroring theirs. My friend looked at me with his hands on his head. What do we do? I don't know, dude. Let's just try to get back. So, without another word, we started descending down the hill. As we did, the other pair of men seemed to go down their hill, and so they faded out of our view, much to our relief. Keep in mind, the smell of flowers was still so potent in the air. We finally got to the low point between the two slopes, and as we did, the rain picked up from a light drizzle to a heavy downpour. Let's hurry it up, I said. Ricky didn't respond. A rather brisk few minutes later, we were atop the hill, where we were once again greeted by the fallen tree. Both in front of us and behind us, the situation was the same. Reality seemed to be mirrored, and in both directions, we could see copies of ourselves sitting atop the hill just like we were. Ricky was starting to panic. Trying to be logical, I decided to get out my phone, preparing to document whatever in the world was going on. To my dismay, my device didn't turn on. It was a new, premium smartphone with an almost full battery, yet it was completely unresponsive. The screen just remained black as I pushed the power button. Try yours. Rick got out his phone, and it didn't work either. At this point, the sky was beginning to get dark, and the rain was pouring. It's not working. What the heck do we do, man? I shook my head. I had no idea. That's when we heard a voice. Are you boys lost? The voice was mature and feminine. It was well enunciated but coated in a thick accent. I'm not very good with dialects, but I'd guess it was European. We both turned, looking to the side of the path and into the woods. About 10 feet in front of us, seated casually on a stump, was a woman, but she was no ordinary woman. The moment I saw her, I felt as if I was intoxicated. She was sitting, but we could tell she was tall, taller than either of us. She was slim but very toned. She had fair skin with no visible imperfections, and her hair was short and jet black. I can easily say she was the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. I inexplicably felt magnetized to her. Her outfit, though, that was the weirdest part of all. She wore a dress like one you'd expect to see at a party, and it was accessorized by a large black sun hat. Very strangely, her clothes showed no signs of being wet or weathered at all, despite us being in the middle of a storm. We both gazed at her in awe. She stood up, walking towards us. "Well?" She strutted, as if on a catwalk. "Are you or are you not?" Rick's tongue was completely tied. I managed to stammer out a few words, though. Yeah, we are." As she came close to us, it became suddenly apparent she was the source of the floral smell. That isn't any good." She turned away from us. "Lost on a mountain, especially in all this fog. That's just a recipe for trouble." That's when we noticed that the fog, which was quite thin before, was suddenly very heavy. We couldn't see 10 feet in front of us. I nudged Ricky and whispered, "Dude, is that who you saw before?" He whispered in reply, "Yeah, 100%. She turned back around, looking at us, as if waiting for us to say something. She seemed to be evaluating us with her piercing blue eyes. "Well, come on then." She waved her hand and began pacing down the mountain. We followed on command. Again, I can't explain it, but the woman was enchanting in a very unnatural way, and it left us practically helpless. It was only a few minutes before she stopped. The entire time, though, her dress didn't get any wetter from the rain. It was as if she had an invisible umbrella, dissipating the drops as they fell. "You can take it from here, I suppose." She turned around to face us, and as she did, the fog thinned back to regular levels. That's when I realized that we were back at the start of the trail, only a few meters into the woods. The exit and the parking lot were visible. She moved to the side, allowing us to pass. We walked by, still in a trance. Before we exited the woods, though, I turned around. I wanted to thank her, or something. It's hard to explain, but I wanted to get one last look at her. When I turned around, though, she was gone. I didn't see how she could have gotten out of sight. It was like she just disappeared. I stood there, bewildered, searching up the mountain with my eyes and seeing no one. The only movement was raindrops. Ricky grabbed my shoulder. "Come on, man. Let's get out of here." Without another word, I followed him back to the SUV and we got in, him in the driver's seat. As we pulled away, though, I took one last glance in the rearview mirror, and just under the glow of the singular street lamp in the parking lot, I could see a silhouette of a woman waving goodbye. We never went back to that park again. That was actually one of our last hikes ever, with me and Ricky growing apart due to the void of misunderstanding the incident created. Recently he moved, and we lost touch entirely. I never saw that strange woman again. Upon researching this online, I've theorized that she was likely a witch or some sort of spirit. Whether she created the mirroring effect in the forest and the extreme weather, I'm unsure. Regardless, I feel indebted to her, as she did save us. There's one last thing I'd like to mention though. Whenever it rains at night, and it does a lot in the interior of British Columbia, I have the same dream. The exact same one, consistently, and I've had it ever since the event. Ricky and I are always on a hike of sorts. It goes normally, with nothing weird happening. Whenever we leave though, I always check the rearview mirror of the car, and I see that woman waving at us. Lost and Scared, from Gundam Sandrock. I was 16 years old at the time. The date was October 2015. I'd gotten into an argument with my mother, so I figured I'd stay at a friend's place. It must have been around 8, as the sun was almost completely down by then. So my friend, we'll call them Heavy Arms, invited me over and told me to take the woodland path. As I'm walking down the path, I felt uneasy on it. It seemed like the further down I went on the path, the more life was absent on it. No birds, deer, squirrels. It was just quiet the entire time, which at that time I thought nothing of it. About 3/5 of the way there to Heavy Arm's house, I hear some kind of screeching mixed with laughter. There was no telling who or what it was from, but it felt as if it was coming from all around me. The hair on my neck began to stand up, and I swear I could feel someone or something's eyes on me. I had reached into my pocket and took out my knife. I turned around and I looked behind me. The next thing I knew, I smelled what I could only describe as someone's rotting dinner that should have been buried, with the hint of burnt nickel. Then I saw this shape. It was an animal of some sort, and it seemed to be in an attack position. Perhaps it was waiting for me, waiting to get a better look. This thing was tall though, taller than me. The creature was between 7 and 8 feet tall, and what drew me to it was really its head and eyes. Eyes that didn't seem to have any soul behind them. They were just milky white, and the head looked similar to a wolf's skull, all bone. As I began to examine it, remaining vigilant, I watched it mirror my movements. I stopped moving around then, keeping my eyes on it to make sure it didn't move any closer to me now. I saw its arms then. They were unnaturally long and bent in front of its legs. Its skin seemed thin and wrapped tightly around muscle and bone. And then I saw its hands, which were covered in blood. I turned my back to it, panicking and starting to run. That's when I heard the same sound from before. A human screech and laughter at the same time. Maybe I was afraid, but I swear I heard the word run somewhere in there. So I ran with everything I had. I could hear something coming from behind me, something that didn't seem too troubled to keep up with me. I looked around. I knew that there had to be a secret path that we had taken before to Heavy Arm's house, but I wasn't seeing it now. I ran faster, but that thing matched my speed. I came to a full stop, desperately launching my knife at the creature, only to have it make that laughing sound again, as if that had been funny to it. I ran to my left. there was a clearing of tall grass. I found one of the few trees there and hid under it. I kept my eyes on the opening of the clearing where I'd entered. I watched that creature come looking for me. Now, with a better look, I could see just how old it appeared. Then it screeched again, but this one was different than before. This one sounded like it was underwater or gargling some kind of liquid. But before long, the creature gave up looking for me. At least it seemed to give up. So I waited about 20 to 40 minutes out there before I came out of my hiding spot. I wasn't sure where I was now, but I did have a vague idea of the general direction Heavy Arm's house should be. I run and run until I see familiar landmarks. Eventually, I do make it to Heavy Arm's back door. I hammered on it, screaming to be let in. Soon the living room light came on from within, and the door unlocked. I ran inside and told my friend to lock it behind me. I told him what happened. Surprisingly, he admitted to me that he had seen something similar before, and that his mom had called a priest to bless the grounds, obviously to no avail so far. To this day, I wonder what on earth I saw that night. Sometimes I wonder why that thing was just playing around with me, like a kid would play with his food. But I'm grateful that I got away. That thing must have been some kind of skinwalker or demon. I got lost in the woods. From MrTerribleDirections. This happened to me when my pals and I went on a dropping. A dropping is when you are dropped at a place you don't know, and you gotta find your way home while people in cars hunt for you, and when they spot you, you get a point. The person with the least amount of points and makes it to the designated place is the winner. My brother and 6 of my pals were fooling around, acting stupid as we always did. To which my dad said, "Don't you numbskulls have anything better to do?" Like what? Well, how about something outside? I chuckled at this, but then Terry suggested, "What do you guys think about going on a dropping?" That sounded like a great idea, so we all agreed. We made our home the place where we had to end up after being dropped. So my parents dropped us all off. My mom said, "Okay, let's see how long it takes you guys to travel 20 miles. They drove off and we all went in 2 different directions. I've always been terrible with directions, so going through the woods probably wasn't the best idea. I walked around for what seemed like hours until I heard the sound of a crying dog. I am an animal lover at heart, so I went looking for it to see what was wrong with this creature. Before long, I stumbled upon a large canine that appeared to be stuck in a bear trap. I wasn't sure if it was a coyote or actually a wolf, but it was definitely quite big. I slowly walked to the trapped wolf. It growled at me, of course, but slowly I got closer and closer. The wolf was beginning to calm down, and I was able to set it free. It looked at me for a moment, then half walked, half limped off, and I went my way as well. After what felt like an hour, I accepted that I was in fact lost out here. But if I keep walking in a straight line, I would be able to find my way to a road or something like it. I walked and walked for hours, but I was still stuck in the woods. At one point, I began to hear branches breaking from behind me. My heart was starting to pound, and I was getting scared. In my mind, I was imagining a huge bear coming out of the bushes, but that idea faded when I heard a weird type of growl, more like a gurgling, actually. I started to run, which I know isn't the best idea to do when facing a wild animal and being lost, but fear got the better of me. Not paying enough attention to where I was running, I tripped and fell, hearing the footsteps gaining on me quickly. It was then that I heard barking. I went to look behind me, and that wolf or coyote I'd saved was barking at what appeared to be my pursuer. I then looked at that creature that had been chasing me. It was extremely skinny with claws and was now running in the opposite direction. The way it ran was strange, as if it wasn't used to running at all, and the gurgling growl I'd heard came from it as it resounded that noise again from its throat. When the creature was out of sight, the friendly canine stopped barking, and when I stood up, it was right next to me. I began to walk again, albeit a bit nervous with this large canine around me. It kept some distance, but it did stay with me. A few times it growled at seemingly nothing or something that was hidden in the woods, which creeped me out, but I just kept on going. I eventually found a road with a diner, and after a few seconds, I saw that it was the diner my dad often goes to with his colleagues. I was so relieved to see a familiar sight. I turned my gaze on the creature I was sure was a wolf. He was still next to me, and then I heard that gurgling growl again. The wolf took a stance, growling at the creature that was now standing within my sightline. Yellow eyes, pale skin, claws, and extremely skinny figure that kept making that gurgling sound, and the wolf then started barking again, apparently scaring that creature off once more. Or so I thought. After I turned around to go towards the diner, I heard the wolf growling again. When I turned my head, my wolf companion was now fighting for its life against that abomination. I kept running towards the diner, scared for my life. When I was at the door, I looked back, but sadly, I didn't see either of those creatures. I arrived at home last and clearly lost the dropping, but my mom looked at me and said, "Well, what happened to you?" I explained everything of what happened in the woods that day. My cuts from the fall healed quickly, but I had nightmares about that creature in the woods for weeks. Occasionally, I still do. Every once in a while, when I'm at the diner, I sometimes think I can see a wolf standing on the edge of the woods, just watching. Well, that's all I have for news stories, sadly. But here are a bunch of really cool Lost in the Woods stories from a few years ago that I hope you'll enjoy. I apologize. I'm trying to do as many news stories as possible, so thank you for bearing with me. There's no coming back from this. Submitted by Connor McMeredith. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. Forgive my brevity, but I was an idiot. I was that guy, the one who thought going off the grid for a week would be easy, who thought surviving in the woods would be a piece of cake. After being an avid camper for the past 3 years, I figured it'd be invigorating, a test of the skills I thought I had. My college allowed us a short month-long break sometime during the fall that year, and I had scheduled a week within that month to lose myself in the nearest national forest. All I would bring with me was a jacket, some clothes, and my phone just in case things got bad. What could go wrong? The week finally came. I was well rested after sleeping in the past few days, and I made sure to eat a big carb-filled meal before I set out. Now, you need to know, I wasn't actually trying to get lost. I usually had a good head about me when it came to backtracking my way out of the woods. Just remember that. After walking about 90 minutes from the side of a trail in the middle of the forest, I was completely alone, and the sounds of people and hikers were far gone. It was comforting, at first. I spent the evening building a triangular shelter between 2 trees that were close enough together to allow that sort of structure. Next, I found some kindling and made myself a small fire. This took a lot longer than it needed to. and when I was finally figuring out where to get some water, it was hours past dark. This was when the fear set in, the realization of what I was doing. It started at the bottommost part of my neck, a tingling sensation that urged me to turn around to make sure I really was alone. This bothered me quite a bit, mostly because I had no actual idea why I felt that way. I soon stumbled upon a creek, and I knelt down to grab a drink of water. It tasted of bark and dirt. It made me wince a little before I reminded myself that this was what I'd been planning for. Snap. A sudden cracking sound made me jump. In an instant, I was upright again and facing away from the water. The woods were silent. The woods were still. I was alone, yet I felt far from it. Probably just a branch breaking from a tree, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I memorized the location of the creek, and I set back towards my camp, breaking branches on the trees along the way so as to create a sort of breadcrumb trail. As I walked back, I found that I was much more sensitive to the noises around me than before. Every little sound made my ears twitch. The sounds of fallen leaves, of wind whistling past empty branches. My heart was pounding, and I knew I was afraid. Back at my camp, the fire was beginning to fade. I rekindled it and sat close to my shelter, staring into those flames. My eyes were wide open. I could barely bring myself to even blink. This was the first night, and I was already so creeped out that I didn't want to go to bed. But I forced myself into my shelter anyway. I laid my head down in the cool soil and tried to catch some rest. Something awoke me in the middle of the night. Something had grasped a hold of my shoulder. It had reached into my makeshift dwelling and shook me awake. It frightened me so much that I kept my eyes closed and pretended to still be asleep. I began to hear those footsteps around me. They were only a meter away at all times, circling my shelter. Soon, they stopped next to the fire which I was facing. It was in front of me. Slowly, I opened my eyes, feeling that I needed to see what or who was out there. At the very least, I should be able to see their legs from beneath the walls of my shelter. But when I opened my eyes, the worst of all my nightmares came true. There was a face shoved into my leafy tent. The white of its eyes were so offset, as its skin was as black as the night. That was all I could take in before I was screaming and staggering away from the figure. The moment I had crawled backwards out of my shelter, I saw that whatever had been there was now gone. I was alone once more. As soon as I gathered myself, I threw dirt onto the fire and began to move toward the trail, away from these woods. 90 minutes, I whispered under my breath. That's all it would take to get out of here. This was a mistake, I told myself. I never should have come out here. At this point, I chalked up the face as a dream, hoping it was but a nightmare invading my reality, maybe from the stress. Now that I was leaving, I was flushed with relief. This would all soon be over, if it wasn't over already. I was going to make it out of this, and I wasn't ever going to come back this way again. As I walked quickly through the leaves and undergrowth, my mind was reeling while I tried to ignore my own thoughts. Then I suddenly stopped. All at once, I couldn't move. Because something was touching me. Something had run its fingers and apparently sharp nails through my hair. I could feel them scraping against my scalp, cold and slow and deliberate. What was happening to me? Was I going crazy? I couldn't turn around. I couldn't will myself to do much more than breathe. But when I heard the whisper, when I heard the wind-like voice in my ear say, "Run," I listened. My whole body listened. I ran for an hour straight, going 4 times the speed compared to when I walked into these woods, yet I should have already made it out. I should have already been off the trail I was looking for, getting into my car and driving away, the woods far behind me, instead of all around me. Run. The voice kept coming, from the left, from the right, from the distance and right behind me. It was everywhere, and I was crying as I wondered when the dream would end, when I would wake up on my couch, anxious but safe. How had I lost my way? This was something that had never happened before, whether day or night. I'd been in the woods enough to know better. Nothing looked familiar. I was lost, and I wasn't alone. Just as I thought I'd perish out there, I tripped and fell nearly face first onto gravel. Gravel. I was back on the trail. I picked myself up, hands full of rocks and dry dirt. I ran down the trail, and in minutes, I saw my car in front of me. In seconds after that, I was igniting the engine and burning rubber. As I stopped only for a second to kick it into drive from reverse, to begin my quick and panicked drive home, for that split second, I saw it. The face in my window, inches from my own. I could see the white eyes on dark as night skin, and I could feel the thing smiling. Time slowed to a crawl. It felt like an eternity, my hand hitting the gear shift and my foot plowing into the accelerator. But soon I was gone. I was peeling the gravel off of the road, getting back on the highway, getting back to the people and noise and concrete, back home. I didn't dare look back. I'd rather pry off my rear-view mirror and throw it on the side of the road than look back. This was my experience. It was the strangest and most terrifying experience in my life. It has scarred me in a way that affects me greatly in my day-to-day life. I get chills throughout my days. I feel that tingle in the back of my neck. I feel the same textured cold as I felt when I laid there that night, pretending to sleep as that thing encircled me. I've heard of the disappearances in the woods, and I've always wondered what was taking people, who or what was causing those disappearances. But this was different. This thing wanted me out of its woods. I was in its territory, and it wanted me gone. Number 2. No Way Out, submitted by NickyAndAzaile. It was a year ago. I was visiting my cousin in the country. She lived very far away, and we rarely saw each other, so we were known to pull some crazy stunts. We were both on the back of a four-wheeler at the time, heading to a small private cemetery just for the fun of it. On the way to the cemetery is a stretch of woods to your left for about half a mile. Something then caught my eye, and I told my cousin to stop. There was an opening in the woods, an opening that hadn't been there before, that was now right in front of us. "What do you think that is?" I asked. "I don't know. It wasn't there before," my cousin said, and we were both perplexed, confused as to how in the matter of a day, someone made a new path in those woods, one that looked so ancient and well-traveled. Well, should we go in there? That was my next question. I don't know, this feels kind of wrong, my cousin answered. Come on, let's just go check it out real quick. I hopped off the four-wheeler, and my cousin was forced to follow me, although hesitantly. The odd thing about this was that oftentimes my cousin was always the one pulling me into mischief. Usually she was the strong-headed one, and I was the worried one. But something was pulling me onto that path. Curiosity, maybe, but something told me that I needed to be in there, that I needed to see. I would be lying if I said that there was anything odd as we walked down the path. The forest was a bit quieter than a normal forest should have been, but nothing else really stood out. Come on, Abby, there's nothing here, my cousin pleaded. I sighed, as I was still set on exploring this new strange place. All right, I gave in. Now, during our walk into the trail, our very short walk, it had not curved at all, nor had we taken any other direction besides straight. The trail seemed to go on and on. We had just walked in and traveled for a few minutes, but as we tried to walk out, heading straight back the way we came, the trail seemed to never end. The woods became infinitely distant. I even checked my phone, and it showed that we had been on this path for half an hour now. Faith, check this out. I showed my cousin the time, and her eyes widened. But that's impossible. We've only been in here for a couple of minutes. I know, I agreed. I turned it off, and we kept walking in silence. Several more minutes later, I spoke up, my voice trembling. Faith, I think we're lost. There's no way we didn't go any direction but straight, she said. Now we were both worried. We just kept walking for what seemed like another quarter of an hour. Faith, we're so lost, I said helplessly. That was when she stopped. Without turning towards me, she shushed me. Hush. What? I said. Did you hear that? I hadn't heard anything, so I shrugged my shoulders. Moments later, however, I did hear a branch snap somewhere in the woods. Abby, someone's following us. It's probably just a fox, Faith, or some other animal. My cousin shook her head. Suddenly, to our horror, all around us we began to hear footsteps. Footsteps coming right at us. Without so much as a word, Faith broke into a full-fledged run, and I followed her. She screamed, and I booked it after her, but since she was taller than me, she ran a little faster, and soon I was lagging behind. I was terrified, scared that I'd end up running through an endless forest on my own. But no, as if some higher power answered our mental cries, the woods ended, and we were back on the trail and next to the four-wheeler. We hopped on and floored it back home. On the way, I looked at my phone again. It had been 75 minutes since we went into those woods. Somehow, in a matter of minutes, we had lost over an hour of time. It didn't make any sense. We never really talked about the event again, but the next time we went to the cemetery, we kept an eye out for that trail. We were ready to pass it on the way, ready to pretend that we weren't looking at it or acknowledging that it was there, pretending that we weren't afraid to look in its direction. But when we did go back, the trail was gone, as if it had never been there. There were no openings in the woods at all. What happened that day? And where did we go? Number 3. The scariest thing that has ever happened to me. Submitted by Dave W. I'm a professional security contractor. Most of what I do is setting up security for remote, secure locations in North and South America. I'm basically the guy a company will hire to make sure that its employees are safe whenever the government is not able to get people to a location quickly enough to respond to an issue. For example, when a logging company sends people to work in an area deep in the Amazon, they hire me to make sure illegal loggers, poachers, or other criminals don't come and harm them. Most people don't realize that a lot of illegal loggers are armed, and sometimes they're very aggressive, especially when they might believe they're going to get caught. A few years ago, I got hired to do exactly this. We were very deep in the Amazon, and the company I was working for was clearing an area to be used as a landing site for helicopters, which was how this particular company delivered basic supplies like food, water, and equipment to its employees. This area would become the base camp for the employees. The first day, I went with one of the senior employees to walk in a broad circle around the camp, discussing things like setting up remote cameras in certain locations, where to station guards in certain places the employees would have to avoid for their safety. As we were walking, we noticed strips of red fabric on some of the trees near what was to be our camp. This was alarming, because illegal loggers often mark trees like this so that they don't get lost. There were no other legitimate logging operations in the area at the time. The guy I was with wanted me to remove them, but I told him no, that it could be dangerous. You don't want to provoke anyone else who might be out there. The next day, I went back to the area where the marked trees were to investigate a bit further. An area of the ground had a rectangular hole in it. It was about 6 feet wide and a few feet deep. Nearby, I saw a camouflage net and some tent pegs that had been used to cover it the day before. Someone had hid something in the ground there, and I hadn't noticed it earlier. I looked down into the hole to see that it was nearly full of old backpacks. They weren't all hiking bags or rucksacks like you would expect. Some were children's school bags, some fanny packs like a tourist would wear. Many of them had names in English on them. They were full of personal belongings, such as clothes and trinkets that you would buy as souvenirs, though there were no towns or cities nearby. I took pictures of this and immediately reported it back to base camp. I set up a trap camera looking over the cache of old bags, and then I left. When I got back, I got on my satellite phone and reported this to the local government, who promised to send someone to investigate. They would be there in a few days, as the area was not cleared for the helicopters yet, and would not be for at least a week or two. That night, we were all on full alert. Guards worked 12-hour shifts, and no one was allowed to leave the camp for safety. The loggers worked all throughout the night, and we had no problems. The next day, I went to retrieve the trap camera. All the backpacks were gone. My camera had been pulled from its place and smashed into little bits onto the ground. "What the?" I said. And then I heard the running, coming in my direction. It was clearly multiple people, though I couldn't see them through the vegetation. I was armed and ready to defend myself, but I realized I could not run back to the camp, as then I would risk the camp being discovered by these people. I got into cover, and I took aim. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, knowing I was outnumbered, and that I probably wouldn't make it out alive if they saw me. I began to pray, hoping that I would win this game of hide and seek. Suddenly, a man with a machete burst out of the bushes right in front of me. He stared right at me. He took a slow step towards me, but when he saw that I was aiming at him, he smiled and said in plain English, "Soon." then backed into the bushes. I waited there for an hour, and I didn't hear anything else. Making sure I wasn't followed, I steadily went back to camp, reported again what had happened. We decided it was time to abandon the project here, and we all hiked to the nearest clearing, 8 miles away. There we were picked up by helicopters. We left all the equipment behind. A week later, I returned with a large group of police officers. All of our equipment had been stolen or vandalized. The bags were gone. The worst part was that inside of my tent, a large machete had been staked into a picture of my wife. The guy knew where I slept. They must have been watching our camp the whole time. It turned out, this was an active group of the worst kind. People involved in the disappearances of those who were lost in the woods, those who couldn't find their way back, and those who stepped a little too far beyond the tree line. All those backpacks that I saw in that hole, they all used to belong to a person who made one mistake and got lost in these dense forests and was never seen or heard from again. Number 4. Lost in the Woods. Submitted by Kai. About a year ago, my family lived in a house basically surrounded by woods and wildlife. I was used to my surroundings, and I thought I knew the woods there like the back of my hands. I often went on hikes out there, daring myself to go further each time. Well, on a certain occasion, I went a little too far, and I soon found myself lost. Usually, my backup was to pull out my phone, and if I really was lost, I could use it as a GPS to find my way back. But this time, my phone had no reception. I'd really gone far, too far. I wandered around in the woods, and the sun was beginning to set, so I decided to find somewhere as a shelter, somewhere I could stay overnight. I stumbled upon a den, and I sat at the opening, a small cave with a mouth that overlooked the forest. I sat there wondering. I'd been gone so long. Had my family called the authorities already? Sent out a search party to look for me? How embarrassing. Lost around my own home. And Lord knows how much more lost I've gotten since I couldn't find my way with the GPS. I sat there for a while with nothing to do. It was warm still, and there was no need for a fire with that temperature. So I grew bored pretty fast. I turned around and decided to explore further in the cave. About a minute in, I found something strange. There was an old wooden chair scooted partially out from under an old wooden table. They looked ancient, like nobody had used it in a while. They looked weathered beyond their ages. It was definitely weird that someone might be in here hanging out at certain times, but I decided to keep exploring. Only 30 seconds later, 30 seconds past that table, I found an odd wooden chest. The chest was maybe half my size, and I was a grown man, so it was pretty big. Curiously, just as any person would, I decided to open it just to see inside. Who knows what could be in there? Maybe some treasures of some untold variety. As I slowly opened it, the creaking sounds it made scared me. If there was someone out there, someone I didn't want to run into, these creaking sounds would give away my position. I felt like I was in trouble. With every creaking inch, I knew something was hearing me. Something knew I was there. I shook off my paranoia and just opened it. When I saw what was inside, my heart seemed to stop and my stomach sank. Dozens of shoes, all youth and children's sizes. Some new, some old, some clean, some not. They came in every shape and size, but all children's sizes. What was this doing here? Why was it here? Before I could freak out or blurt anything in surprise, I heard someone coming in the distance. I threw myself in the chest, struggling to shut it as there were so many shoes inside already. Plus, the smell wasn't too great. Sure enough, I was finally able to close the lid. Then I covered my mouth, tried not to breathe too loud, and I sat there listening. Approaching quickly were the sounds of 2 sets of different footsteps, both much heavier than my own. And then there was another sound, like someone grunting under a cloth or pillow. That's how I could describe it at the time. Suddenly, there was a thud coming from the entrance of the cave, followed by a loud moan. "Yeah, just leave him here," said a voice. "All right, now let's get going." Then the 2 sets of footsteps, now lighter, began to walk away. Several minutes after their sounds had faded, I finally willed myself out of that chest, every little noise echoing in that cave. I stumbled slowly to the edge of the den, watching each and every one of my steps so as to not hit a pebble that would give away my presence. There on the ground was a boy with duct tape over his mouth, and his feet were tied together. He began to mumble, as if pleading me for help. I started to untie his shoes, but then I faced him and looked him in the eye. Adrenaline pumped through me, and I put my finger over my mouth. "You have to stay quiet, okay? You can't say a word when I take off this duct tape. If you want to live through this, stay silent." He nodded, quickly and frantically. I threw off the rope that remained, and I steadily peeled off the duct tape, though I couldn't save him from the sting of it. Together, without a word, we began our journey through the woods, and I kept my eyes out, ready to see those men at any time. Luckily, we never stumbled upon them. By early morning, we made it out of the woods, and I was right. My family had called in a search party. There were police cars there and people with flashlights scanning the surrounding woods. I slowly made my way cautiously up to one of the searching officers, and I told him everything. I pointed him in the direction of that den, and I told him everything that we had found. Now that I was safe, and they had someone who had been lost in custody, they went back into the woods behind us and searched for the den. We took the boy inside, made him some hot soup and tea, and tried to keep him comfortable, though mostly he just sat in silence, too afraid to speak, too in shock to eat. Hours later, the police came back to our house, and they had something to tell us. This was the most worrisome part of all. They did find the den, but there was no trace of the wood chair, the wood table, the wooden chest, let alone any shoes. But, they said, there was an obvious sign of someone clearing out the place, signs that someone had left in quite the hurry. So now we know. Now we get to live with the thought that those men are still out there. They're still at large, still searching for the next set of shoes to add to their collection.